Plans Panel meeting, where we're all here in person, much better than Zoom. And of course, we did have a site visit. A number of you were on it this morning. And I think it's much better than any maps that officers or plans can show us, actually being there to see for yourself. And we were entertained by the delights of Morley from Councillor Finnegan. And we had a nice walk. Okay, back to business then. Now, Neil, behave yourself. You don't get this chit chat on Zoom, you know. Can we come to order? As you know, my name is Councillor Jim McKenna, and I will be chairing today's meeting. City Centre Plans Panel deals with applications from the city centre, as well as the largest and most significant applications the council receive. The aim of the panel is to hear all the relevant information from applicants, members of the public and council officers to help members of the panel make their decision. Could I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves and mute your microphone once you have introduced yourself. Okay, can I start on my left, please? Mark? It's me, Mark. Should we go there?
It's Mark Jackson, Principal Planning Officer.
Leavers, Flood Risk and Drainage.
Gillian McLeod, Transport Development Services Manager.
Councillor Elizabeth Nash, Hunslet and Riverside Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Peter Carlill, Carvely and Farsley Ward.
Good afternoon at last. It's Councillor Caroline Gruen, Bramley and Stanningley Ward.
Good afternoon, folks. Councillor Neil Walshaw, Headingley and Hyde Park Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Al Garthwaite, Headingley and Hyde Park Ward.
Hello everyone, Councillor Kaylee Brooks, Little London and Woodhouse Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Colin Campbell.
Afternoon, my name is Robert Finnegan. I'm a councillor for the Morley North Ward.
Good afternoon, everybody. Councillor Dan Cohen from the Woodley Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Barry Anderson, Adeline Wharfdale Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Graham Latty, Guiseley and Rawdon Ward.
Afternoon, John Grieve, Governance Services, and I'll be clerk at today's meeting.
Good afternoon, Stephen Varley, Design Officer.
Good afternoon, everyone. Matthew Hills, Legal Officer.
Good afternoon, Paul McGrath, School Place Planning Team.
Good afternoon, Jonathan Carr, Head of Development Management.
Thank you for that. And nice to have Tom here. I think it's the first time we've had anybody from drainage for many, many a year. Okay, I'm sure there'll be questions. And Paul as well from education. You're both very welcome. Can I move over to you, John, please, and introduce the items?
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item 2, there are no items which require exclusion of the press and public. Under item 3, I'm not aware of any late items of business. Agenda item 4, could I ask members to declare any interest they may have? I'll assume that's none. Item 5, apologies for absence have been received from Councillor David Blackburn and Councillor Paul Wadsworth. We've got Councillor Barry Anderson stepping in. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Barry, for stepping in. Moving on to the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 30th of September, which was not chaired by myself, it was chaired by Councillor Walshaw. So I'm looking to Councillor Walshaw if there's any corrections or any mistakes on that one. Okay, can we accept those minutes as a true and correct record? Yep, lovely, good stuff. And thanks, Neil, for standing in. It was one of those days, wasn't it? One of those weeks, but thank you for standing in a short notice. Is there any matters arising? No. Okay, then can we move straight on to the main item on our agenda, which is agenda item 8. And Mark, can I ask you to introduce it, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. This is an application that was brought before members on the 8th of July for the erection of 450 dwellings on a parcel of land known as Laneside Farm off Victoria Road in Cherwell. The scheme was brought before members and the application was discussed at length. The outline planning permission was granted by the plans panel back in 2017. And this is a reserved matters application for the design, layout, scale, appearance, and landscaping of the 450 new homes. At the plans panel, the resolution sought further information and clarification on and further discussions to be held with the developer in respect of further information on the drainage issues, further clarification around the provision of a primary school, further details around the biodiversity improvements across the site, further clarification on the proposed climate change measures, and further discussions to take place on the design quality, including the layout of the streets and the street scenes. I have since been together with various other officers in discussions with the applicant about those matters, and the applicant has submitted further drainage strategy information regarding drainage strategy, a technical note on the location of the school, and further ecological assessments of the site, energy efficiency and renewables plans showing where their strategy, how their strategy will pan out through the course of the development, and further highways technical note demonstrating and showing that every home will have a electric car charging point. Since the plans panel, there has been 44 further representations made by members of the public, and including a further representation from former Councillor Ledley, who spoke at the plans panel previously. In terms of the issues raised by the representations and Councillor Ledley, no new issues have arisen that require further consideration. So all material considerations have been outlined in the original Chief Planning Officer's report and the Chief Planning Officer's report that it was on the agenda for this plans panel. Since the plans panel, national planning policy has slightly changed insofar as the design model has been put forward and is to be considered when assessing design. I'm going to take you through the points that were required to be looked at and give you a bit more information about the discussions that have been held and further clarification on those issues. So taking them in turn, drainage strategy, as previously brought before members, the strategy was the general principle of the development was subject to drainage details being submitted as part of the condition. In terms of, since this reserve matters application was submitted, the lead local flooding authority have been in discussions with the applicant, and a drainage strategy was submitted. Since coming back to you with this proposal, further discussions have taken place, and the drainage strategy has outlined where attenuation tanks will be, but also further measures such as a swale, which is to be provided on a parcel of land that is in the ownership of the applicant. As I'm pointing to here, so it's off-site provisions, but under the control of the applicant. You can just see the swale in the parcel of land. The strategy includes attenuation ponds under a parcel of land located in what is considered to be the best location given the topography of the site. And this overall strategy, whilst calculations for surface water runoff have not yet been agreed, this general strategy is considered to be an acceptable way forward. And as often is the case, details such as the calculations are still subject to the conditions that were imposed on the outline planning permission. With regards to the location of the school, members rightly raised concerns with regards to the location of the school within the site and questioned the future implications of its location. The applicant, through the course of the application, the applicant has discussed the layout with the urban design team and other council officers. And in terms of the reason for the provision of a site for a future school, it was always considered in the outline planning consent that was approved by members. A section 106 legal agreement was entered into to secure the future development of a school should the need arise and the need be there in the local area. Through the course over the site allocation plan process and adoption, it was always considered that this site was the best location for future provision of a school should it arise. And in terms of its location in the middle of the site, this was considered to be the best way to ensure that a location of a school isn't on the Elland Road / Victoria Road junction, which would undoubtedly have a much bigger impact on traffic and the general amenities of the area. In the previous plans panel, it was questioned. There was various questions regarding what the implications would be in terms of traffic and future traffic generation through drop-offs and pickups, and also what would be the outcome if a school wasn't required. How would this parcel of land end up being? How would it be visualized within the street? It must be stressed that it's the Education Authority who, on the completion of the 240th dwelling, will have to look at the forecasting and the need of that area as to whether a school is required. The parcel of land is 1.8 hectares in size, which is what government guidance under DEFRA considers acceptable for a two-form entry school for the school buildings, the school playing fields, school car parking and drop-offs. So where the developer has worked with us, knowing that it will not be the developer who ultimately has control over whether that is built out, what the developer has tried to look at in the layout is making sure that the infrastructure that they're providing in terms of the spinal route through the site can accommodate vehicles but also looking at providing a 6.75 metre width carriageway so that ultimately, if a bus service were to be put on by the bus companies, it could be accommodated. The infrastructure has also looked at providing segregation of the pedestrian footpaths and cycleways to the carriageway to ensure that, again, there is safe accesses for pedestrians, for cyclists, which I can show you on. Sorry, Lewis, please, the clicker isn't working. Please, could you put slide? Sorry. Slide 11 on.
Apologies, it seems we're just having some issues with the internet at the moment. It's just been a bit finicky.
Thank you. So as you can see here, this looks at the connectivity, and whilst the school is in the central part of the site, there is footpaths that run separated from the carriageway to make sure that the school ultimately, where the developer has control over providing infrastructure, the future infrastructure is there that would go above what other housing estates in the city have done before. In my report, I do make reference to other sites that, such as the Barrett scheme on A650, where the planning inspectorate upheld the application, and the parcel of land for the school is actually right next to the A650, which is something wanted to be avoided in this particular case, to ensure that a school that has originally been foreseen that the housing that will surround it will be the generator of the need for the school potentially, and therefore looking to make sure that this is sustainably located within this parcel of land and within its wider area. Moving on to the next point, and clarification regarding the biodiversity improvements. This links strongly with the climate change measures that are being proposed, and I shall touch on both together at this stage. The development originally at outline stage was required to provide biodiversity improvements across the site. It's understood that the 2017 is some years ago now, before the climate emergency. And as a result of this, and as a result of the comments that you made at the last plans panel, I've gone back to the developer and discussed and required that a further ecological assessment has been made. The applicant has willingly done this and provided a further biodiversity assessment, which has, sorry, Louise, can I get slide 3 again? Sorry, 4 actually. Thank you. So the applicant has looked at the biodiversity across the site. It's recognised that it needs to improve the pond drainage, and it's also recognised that it needs to provide open space that is well located but can actually be used by the community, but also serve the biodiversity net gain. And as a result of this, has looked at a parcel of land to the southeast to also not only deliver drainage improvements, but also deliver biodiversity net gain. So the biodiversity net gain is in line with national planning policy insofar as the offsite links via public rights of way, but it also, not only does it actually meet the 10% net gain that the council is seeking to achieve on all applications, but it's far exceeded that by providing 14.7% biodiversity improvements across this site and the off-site parcel of land that is shown in front of you. This links heavily with not only the drainage, but the climate emergency and the environmental impact that the housing scheme has. But further to, again, the conditions that were imposed on the outline consent, the applicant, due to the phasing of the development, will not only meet the requirements of planning policies EN1 and EN2 by delivering the renewables required of those policies, but it will also ensure that as the stages of development progress, they will also improve upon those policies by meeting the building regulations requirements. So this will then ultimately exceed the planning policy requirements that were set out in 2017. I know there was slight confusions in the previous plans panel, but it has fully been confirmed that the car charging electric vehicle points will be provided on all the dwelling houses. With regards to the final point that was raised in the resolutions, it was required that further discussions were to take place on the design quality, including the street scene. These, if I could update members, further CGIs, computer generated images, have been received that are very similar to the ones that you have in your presentation pack, but just outline the improvements to the biodiversity within the streets. If you, Lewis, if you could go to the last CGIs. I think the visuals provide how the context of the streets will look and how the individual houses may appear within the street scenes. The house types have been discussed with urban design colleagues, and the window fenestrations, the palette of materials are all considered, the scale and forms of the different dwellings are considered to give a high quality scheme that is above and beyond what we have previously seen on other applications that have been approved. Overall, just to summarise, the matters that were raised in the plans panel have been addressed by the significant work that has been put in by council officers and the developer, and it is respectfully requested that this is discussed further and determined. Thank you ever so much. That was said very cheekily, sorry.
Thank you, Mark. Excellent report. And I think all the points raised by members have been addressed within the report. Members, of course, can ask questions on that, should they wish to do so. Can I remind you that we have Tom here from drainage and Paul from education, and those were two issues that was discussed. So feel free to ask questions of officers, Mark, or anybody relevant you want to. And I'll start with Graham then, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of points. When you were talking about the drainage, you did say that effectively that the quantity of the runoff wasn't yet, the amount wasn't finalised. That does sound a little bit vague in terms of telling us that it's all in hand and that can be coped with. Could you explain what you said, please? And the other bit was, in terms of the school, or possible potential school, how many children do we, for the sake of argument, does this development, or could it raise? How many kids could it put into the school? In other words, what is the potential for the school being used by the surrounding area, and the potential for traffic, which you've touched on? you know, could it be a local school? I mean, I'm not big on kids, and I don't really.
He was one himself, wasn't he?
It's a long time ago, Barry. So I haven't the vaguest idea what a two-form entry school holds in terms of numbers. So if you could tell me that, that'd be great.
Thank you, Graham. Mark, maybe you could start, and we have Tom and Paul come in then, in any order. I don't mind.
Thank you. I think that would, as Councillor Kennedy's as Chair's just said, I think it would be best placed if I could pass over to Tom Beavis from flooding to answer the flood risk, and then on to Paul, if that's okay, with regards to the school potential placements.
Okay, the quantity of discharge is fixed. I think what he was referring to was the actual detailed design of the drainage system, the final detailed drainage design of the drainage system in terms of the pipe diameters, the gradients, etc. Because until you know the exact layout, you can't identify how much you're draining. The quantity that will discharge from Cotton Mill Beck is fixed. It's fixed by the outline at 47 litres a second, which is the greenfield runoff. So there is no increase in the runoff from the site.
Thank you. So just going through the questions, in terms of the capacity of the school, a two-form entry school would equate to 420 children in total if the school was full. So that would be 2 classes in each of 7 year groups with up to 30 children in each class. Running through from reception to year 6. There would also potentially be a nursery for the school as well in addition to that. And in terms of the development, we work on a pupil product ratio of 25 primary age children for every 100 dwellings on average from new build schemes in Leeds, which equates to for 450 units, around 113 children in total on first occupation, which would be equivalent to around 16 children per year group. So that's just over half a form of entry, which means we would require about 3/4 of the intake actually to come from the surrounding area to fill the school in total.
Okay, great. Robert, please.
A couple of questions for highways and then one for Mark at this particular point. In terms of highways, we saw this morning, and you've shown in the other earlier presentations that we've got, that there's one entrance in breach of policy, but leave that alone at this particular point. And there's an emergency entrance. Now, what's to stop those who are near the Harwell end? I think Barry raised this morning, because the main roads, if you like, to the estate actually run over this emergency road, which it isn't to be adopted, isn't to be brought up to standard. What's to stop those at the far end using that road? And wouldn't you agree that its entry onto Victoria Road is dangerous if you are getting a significant volume of vehicles exiting at that particular point? Because there are no visibility displays and there's nothing. And the second question to highways is, Persimmon are already by legal agreement obliged to pay a significant sum to try and resolve the problems of congestion down at the ring road. As I understand it, that's a £4 million scheme that the Combined Authority haven't got the money to actually cover at this particular stage. So is it not the case that at this particular point, whatever additional traffic this estate produces will just make that congestion worse until cash is found somewhere else, not from the developer, somewhere else to resolve the problems on the ring road? That's 2 questions for highways. The other questions for Mark, and I love this one. How many metric tons of CO2 will it take to build this housing estate? And how many metric tons a year will it generate in terms of CO2 production? I've got the answers if you want them.
We bring in Gillian first, and I'll give Mark a chance to think on the more difficult question.
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of what stops people exiting, certainly on the outline planning permission, we do have conditions. Condition 33 is about prior to commencement of development, details of measures to control farm access control gates. And condition 31 is about before development commences a detailed plan of the emergency vehicle access to include details of pedestrian and cycle provision to be approved in writing. So we haven't got the full details yet of the measures, but the proposals that we would be looking for is some form of either rise lower bollard or gate that ensures that general traffic from the development can't egress onto Victoria Road at that point. I don't know if we could have the plan up. Have we got a plan that actually shows that egress, Mark, or not? But there are works being done to that access to actually split off the vehicular path and the pedestrians as well at the emergency access point. Do you have one in more detail or not? If you don't, that's fine.
Is it possible to have slide 8? Just shows that slide.
So there could be potential for adoption, but it wouldn't be adopted as a carriageway. It would be as a footway, cycleway. But with the public right of way running over there, it could just be that the road is made up at that point. Okay. In relation to the works on the ring road, certainly the combined authority have put some funding in towards the outer ring road, and the junctions that are currently being designed up in detail do include the junction at the bottom of Cherwell Hill. So there is £1.5 million proposed that comes from this development that's already in the section 106 of the outline, and that will be a significant contribution to that scheme. So I can't give exact timings, I haven't got those available to me, but there is every intention that these works will be pursued in the short term.
To be honest, the issue is it's not fully funded, which I think the highways officer was accepting at this particular point. And the highways officer didn't deal with the vehicular access out of the, if you like, the emergency entrance and so whether it was or wasn't safe.
Sorry if I've missed that. In terms of the actual access, we did look at outline stage at visibility displays. They are limited, and that was the reason why we didn't want this as a standard access for all traffic. Therefore, we are just keeping the access there for emergency vehicles. Emergency vehicles tend to be higher up. They tend to have be closer in. They tend to have better visibility than standard cars anyway. But it is used now for the local residents and the farm. So I think there is not going to be an intensification on there.
Thank you, Julian. Mark, please.
So to answer your question, I don't have specific figures that you request, but you say you have those answers, so I'm sure you can share those with us. What I would like to just sort of point out with this, and going on the sustainability points, the site is the housing need across the city, as you're all fully aware, is the reason why we have our site allocation plan and our adopted development plan. In terms of this development has been approved at outline by a plans panel, and in terms of bringing this forward, this is a more sustainable site than bringing forward safeguarded sites, for instance, that there's various sites in this local area which ultimately may come forward if this didn't go ahead. In terms of the actual emissions of the individual houses, as outlined in my report, the developer has achieved the policy requirements for our renewable and energy reductions, and goes beyond that as the development will be progressed and phased. But I'm sorry, I can't give exact figures.
Happy to share if that's helpful. The Committee on Climate Change suggests that it's 36,000 metric tons of CO2 to build these houses, and that's based on them being 2-bed, and a lot of them aren't, a lot of them are 4-bed. And even at 2030's specifications, there will be 80 metric tons a year of CO2 generated. In contrast, as it stands at this particular point, the site is absorbing 118 metric tons of CO2 per year. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Robert. Have you noted that, Mark? I'm sure you have. Okay. All right, moving on then. Kaylee, please.
Thanks, Chair. So Councillor Latty asked one of my questions already. Thank you, Councillor Latty. But I've noticed there's only the one entry point. Now, I was not elected at the time when this passed as an outline. So I'm lacking a little bit of the sort of detail in some ways as to how it's got to this stage. But I was just wondering why there's only the one highways entry point when we've been told before that good design is to have 2 entry points. I was just wondering why that was, please. Oh, and also in terms of the design of the buildings, I noticed on site there's lots of really lovely, like Victorian, like 1970s, really good quality builds, like and then stone built buildings nearby. I was just wondering which area was taken as inspiration for the design of the buildings, please.
That's a good question, and I'll pass the first one on to Gillian regarding the one entrance, and then maybe Stephen, you might want to come in on the design of the housing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. At outline stage, we tried really hard to get a second means of access in line with our street design guide. We had negotiations about whether we could get an access into the Harwells to the to the north on that plan. It's yes, to the north, or a second access onto Victoria Road. It would have required, the Victoria Road access would have required demolition of an existing property because the existing, where we've got the emergency access, we don't have the width or the visibility displays to get a fully safe second means of access. So the discussion very much centred around what could be done to mitigate the impact of just having one vehicular access. And what we do and what we recommended at the time was that we have a very short stub road. So the distance between Victoria Road and where the internal residential road split is only very short. So effectively beyond that point, you've got 2 means of access to get to that point. And that short length means that the likelihood, the risk of anything happening at that specific point is limited because of its length. The access road, the one that's yellow on the plan that's shown, is a bit wider. It would allow a bus to come through the site as well, and it also therefore helps us with maintenance and that side of things. So they were and then of course we do have the emergency vehicular access point, but as I've just said, it would be for emergencies only. But that, they're the mitigating reasons why in the end the panel decided that at outline stage that was an acceptable means of access for the site, and that issue wasn't a reserve matter, it was decided at outline stage.
Okay, Kaylee, we'll move on to your second question if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. I do apologise I wasn't on the site visit this morning. As regards the character I think I suggest the clients that the applicants haven't actually particularly decided to draw on a specific character. 400 and odd houses will form a character area of its own. You with me? You know, this is not 2 or 3 houses you're fitting in within a while. This will be a character area on its own when it's established. Even half-built 200 houses formed a character area. They've taken their design very much from the general context. There's brick and stone detailing and heads and sills. And eventually we arrive at, within the design coding, that we were happy. It's not going to be a disaster that stands out. You with me? It's going to be very settled and what have you, and hopefully it will form its own character. But I don't think it's driven from any one particular type of context. Is that okay? Thank you.
Just for clarification, it's 3 character areas, but drawing on discussions that Stephen, myself and the applicant have had, as Stephen pointed out, it's 450 houses, and trying to get its own identity and community focus is also, whilst linking it to a wider area, was considered very important. And when looking with the improvements to landscaping and biodiversity, that will actually form a character that, whilst there are verges and grassed areas in other parts that surround that, other estates, this will have a strong character that links with the fields that are beyond, but also with the surrounding area. That was the vision.
Yes, I don't find anything about the design offensive. It's just that I couldn't see anything of the surrounding area sort of incorporated. So I understand the reasoning now. So thank you.
Could I just ask for some of the slides to be brought up so that members can see those? So maybe slides 20 or 21, perhaps. But if I could also just state with regards to the individual house designs, the window fenestrations, the palette of materials are considered to have a strong design. I think it's also maybe important to also point out that houses, as we try and improve the climate, the energy efficiency of these buildings, there is a degree of these houses will have to be more airtight. So the overhanging eaves that maybe were traditionally adopted have to be a bit less, they're not as prominent on these. But in terms of their character of the buildings themselves, it is considered that they are of good design in terms of windows, doors, heads and sills over the windows, etc.
I have a few more lists in front of you. Is that okay? Can we move on? Can I bring in Colin, please?
I've got a couple of questions, Chair, but can I just pick up on that last comment, which basically what you appeared to be saying to us was throughout the life of the development, the developer are proposing to build to 3 different standards. So there's the standard that meets building regulations now, the one that might reach regulations in 2023, 26, and another one. But what you appear to say is they're going to have to tweak the design to make it do that. So when you show us those images, and they are bland, we certainly don't set the blood racing in design terms. I'm trying to visualize, because this is a big development over a long period of time, I'm trying to visualize where, if we start from here, what it might look like when we get to there. So can I ask that question, which is not my original question, but I've got a couple of those if I can let me in later.
if I could take you to the Chief Planning Officer's report, it outlines in terms of the improvements in terms of energy efficiency in building regs is the different renewables, and there will be a point where they, in terms of energy efficiency, it might be a change in terms of the insulation used at those different points in time, but the appearance of the buildings is how it's presented in these drawings. And as I've said, for the other reasons, we consider that to be acceptable.
Right. Okay.
Sorry.
I think I follow that. You appeared to imply that if I don't know, the overhangs are going to be different, things like that, that there'd be a tweak to the design. So all you're saying to me is between phase 1 and phase 3, the insulation in the wall will get thicker and that sort of thing. All right, it's real.
Apologies if that was misleading. The designs are as the drawings
are. Okay. Right. Can I ask two lots of questions? Normally, Chair, at the beginning, you always say, well, we've got the developers here if you want to ask them some questions, but you missed that out this time. So I'm assuming the people behind me are the developers. So I've got 3 questions for them.
Can I stop you? Because I was about to make that offer, that they're all sat there. And when you, Mark, answered the last question, I thought, well, maybe one of the developers might be better answering that, although Mark answered it very fine. So can I make an invitation to some architect or one of the developers from Persimmons to come forward? You can bring a friend with you if you're feeling a bit lonely. I know it can be intimidating, sat all on your own, so do feel free to do that. If you'd introduce yourself, and then I think Colin will have questions to put to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I need to bring some glasses. Everybody's that far away from me. I'm glad there's a TV in front of me I can see. Yes, Stuart Natkus from Barton Wilmore, the planning consultant who worked on the outline application and has assisted with the reserve matters. We do have a team of people, as you've noticed. We've got ecology, landscape, drainage, highways with us. So if there is something very specific, I may call for one of them to come up, and I'll assist as best I can.
Okay. I've just got four quick questions. Part of the discussion relates to different building standards over different periods of time. So I suppose the question for me is, if you were to receive planning permission today, when do you expect to start on site? And 2, what's the build out rate? 3, you refer, or there's a reference in the report to zero carbon ready. Could you define zero carbon ready for me? And the final one relates to the biodiversity site, the extra site. Can you explain how that will be managed and, if in effect, public access maintained? I've got another officer question as well, Chair. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So the first 3, I think, all sort of linked to climate change. I'll give a broad answer, and if I do miss anything, forgive me. So at the moment, the council have an adopted policy EN1 and EN2 as well, which refers to water. But I think most of this is to do with sort of climate change and the properties themselves. So the outline application has a policy on that requires compliance with that, as it probably gets put on most of the applications that you're dealing with at the moment. But obviously, we're conscious from the last meeting that there was some discussion about the size of this property and how long the development will take to come forward. So we've got 3 different stages that have been identified, and I think the document was circulated that members may have seen. It's on public access, which shows those different phases based on a build out rate of which will be somewhere between probably 30 to 50 homes a year. Now you'll know again from previous submissions that have been made by people about lead-in times. Once this is approved at reserve matters, there will be conditions to discharge. The site will have to be ready, and then we will move on site. So at the moment, the building regulations are set from 2013, which require the amount of insulation, energy saving, CO2, etc. And the first 50 homes are anticipated that they'll be built in line with that. We believe that that's likely to change around about mid-2023. So we think 50 homes by that period when that will come in. And in 2023, the likeness is that the Part L will change. So what we then move on to is a 31% CO2 saving. This is separate to the solar, which is being looked at putting onto the properties as well. And then we've also now got Future Home Standard, which will come in. But at the moment, we don't know exactly what will entail in that and exactly when it will come forward. But we anticipate that effectively 200 homes will probably be built before Future Homes comes in. And then the last 250, which is phase 3 on that, will be included in it. Now, as part of that zero carbon ready, we're looking at where that will be in the future in order to move towards zero carbon homes and how things can be adapted and retrofitted. So there are things being looked at, such as smart homes. I'm sure pretty much everyone around this table has probably got a smart meter at the moment, but actually some of you will probably have the light bulbs that you can switch on from your phones, things like that. So actually we can have smart homes which will introduce that. We're also looking at hydrogen as a power, which again is being looked at, but at the moment, because of being able to resource and bring it in, it's different, which is a huge saving on gas, air source, heat, etc. And then there's also things such as gas saving. So when we look at all of those different options, that will get us to a point where there's a CO2 saving of roughly 75 to 80%, which is where the Future Home Stand will come in. Now, at this moment in time, how that will be achieved and the best ways to achieve that aren't known, because it's quite a way on into the future. But actually the industry is talking to people about how that can be, what the regulations will be. And there's actually a number of things that Persimmon are doing at the moment with a couple of trial sites where they're looking at different options of them. So one of them is Germany Beck in York, which you may be aware of, where some of these things are being tried out. It's effectively a trial and error, look at them, and then also look at, as we go forward, what the funding will be that comes in for homeowners as well. And also in terms of resources, supply, and which are going to be the best ways in order to achieve that. So the application includes that policy commitment to EN1, but let's be honest, EN1 is going to change under your new climate emergency-based local plan updates, which is going to come forward. It's going to be far tighter, and it will probably tie in with Part L, and no doubt the Future Homes will be included in that anyway. So what we're trying to do is give the comfort now that this isn't just going to be an EN1 compliance scheme as it goes forward, because actually things are going to change. And we're trying to give some comfort based on those lead-in times that it will be 50 homes, 150 homes, last 250 homes. And sort of those dates they're not set in stone because we don't know when they're going to come forward, but it looks like they're going to be mid-23, and I think it's 27 for the Future Homes, 25, 27. And then I think there was a final question on how the open space will be managed and maintained. Was that correct?
No, I assume that the open space around within the estate will be down to a management company, because that's the default position these days. What I'm interested in is how are you managing the biodiversity net gain site?
So yes, sorry, apologies. I meant the off-site biodiversity area. It may be, we've got our landscape consultant with him. I'm just looking over to see if Tom's probably best placed to deal with how that will be maintained, because he's been looking at designing that and how it will operate.
While he gets there. So your definition of zero carbon ready is at a given point, it will be possible to add or tweak the house itself to make it, you appear to say 80% carbon.
Yeah, so the homes won't need to change. We wouldn't need to come back in with an application a couple of years to amend the footprints of the houses, the scale of them, or anything like that. Effectively, the shell of the property remains. The design of them is designed in that manner to effectively be future-proof and enable things to come forward. I think that is it's a valid point you raise, and important, because as the council's design officer said, regard's been had to this site as a whole in terms of looking at it as its own character area. And I think if we were to suddenly start to change that in the future, it does start to erode and move away from that. So yeah, they wouldn't alter them in that manner.
Hello. I'm Tom Robinson, the landscape architect working on this. And to answer immediately the question of how the off-site area of biodiversity creation would be managed, it would be managed by the same management plan that manages the landscape of the main site. And that management plan will be not just the usual landscape management, sweep the paths, mow the grass. It's actually worked out with the ecological consultant who is also here. And because what we're doing on some of the public open space areas within the site is trying to broaden the biodiversity value. So you don't simply have the kind of grass that you've got out there. You have, where you need it, grass that you have out there, but also some areas that have a more diverse sward. And because that's part of the aspiration for what we might call the landscape of the main housing area, that's why plots 1 and 2 that are purely there for biodiversity creation are to be appended to this and managed by the same organisation according to the same plan.
Tom, do you want to come back on that, Colin? I know you have a question to officers as well.
No, I'm not sure where plot 1 and 2 is actually.
I beg your pardon. If you go to that
up on screen, if you wait,
if we just,
Lewis, could you put?
Can we get it on the screen
4,
so we can see?
Slide 4, I think it is, Lewis. Thank you.
Plot 2, sorry, jargon terms, it's just how we divide the site. Plot 2 is the larger biodiversity area that's in the bottom, that's it, the bottom right-hand corner. And plot 1 is a little square, that's it, a little square of scrub that's attached to the southeastern edge of the site overall.
Okay, my last. Yes.
Am I aware just to say as well,
Yeah.
the section 106 on the outline permission has the management plan clauses. So the legal agreement on the outline permission will tie into the delivery of the biodiversity, because I think that was where you're coming from with the management plan.
Right. One final quick question. I suppose it's to Gillian. If you remember when we discussed this last time, I did speak at some length about segregated cycle footways, and I noticed that there's been a significant increase in that sort of provision. The question I ask here is the question I asked last time we talked about this, which is what measures have we in place to prevent motorists using the grass verge which separates the two as a car parking area?
Well, I was just, there might be, in terms of the detailed layout, there might be ways of, if there's particular verges that of concern. I mean, round where the middle of the site with the school, there is obviously going to be usual traffic regulation orders that will provide comfort to local residents that areas won't be parked on. In terms of the coming into the site, there are grass verges there, but again, you know, it will be down to looking at making sure that, you know, like with any motorist, you park where it would be safe to park. But in terms of the provisions of parking within the overall site, the parking provision that has been provided is policy compliant. So I suppose it also comes down to the management plan of the landscaping areas.
We're in a slightly, and I know people glaze over because I keep going on about this, but it is this physical separate. The whole point about the cycleway footway is it physically separates pedestrians and cyclists from the road. Yes, great idea. But motorists, in their enthusiasm, have a habit of regarding grass verges as car parking areas. And so the only way to prevent them, in effect,
moving from the highway onto the grass verge, which is only 1 metre wide, plus the footpath, etc., is some sort of barrier. Now, in some areas we've talked about, I think the street design guide says something about hedges. There probably isn't room on 1 metre wide grass verge. So what other measures are in place to stop motorists coming into conflict with pedestrians and cyclists by parking on the grass verge?
We can, the applicant might be best placed to ask this, because it might be something that we can look to put a planning condition on to where there are points that of particular concern. We could look to seek a condition requiring some sort of separation, whether that's some sort of wooden kneeler fencing that would provide that barrier, but also doesn't look out of character or too harsh. And that would be something maybe to ask the developer, but there may be ways there to secure that by design. Well, there certainly is a way to secure, through conditions, a means that would be acceptable to the developer and to yourself there.
Thank you. So is it possible just to put the layout plan up and just to highlight which area in particular the concerns with?
Councillor Campbell,
I'll help you out. Okay. If I look at the map, the purple line on my map, which you can't really see on that one.
Sorry, Lewis, could we have plan 11 up? That shows
right,
the pedestrian,
which shows pedestrian, etc. A substantial number of those actually pass through the green space. So the one down past the down the school, etc., and down the bottom of the map. But there are sections which run from the entrance adjacent to the road, in front of the school, in front of some houses, along the, I can't read the name of the road.
Councillor Campbell,
on the Victoria Road side.
Yeah.
And it's those as opposed to the ones which are in a grassed area.
Thank you. Yeah, and particularly sort of near to the school as well, if there's pickups and drop-offs. I know the point you've made. I mean, I think that there are things that can be done through design features that are put into there. I think the grass verges are a benefit. I think we'd all think that the grass verges are a benefit to have from an aesthetic perspective, but it's looking at ways in which you can prevent that from happening. I mean, to a certain extent, you hope a number of these things police themselves, because it's a community that we're looking to create here and people and neighbours live together. But you then want to try and prevent that through some interventions. So as the officer said, that could be something like a low post and rail fence that would prevent it. We could look at the curb heights in that area, and so there isn't a drop curb, making it a nice easy run for people to pull up, go onto the grass verge and away from it. And potentially planting through the landscaping scheme could come forward as well. So it's really trying to, an even gradients of those verges so that they weren't perfectly flat. And effectively what you're trying to do is avoid them looking like a nice parking area. So through a combination of those things, you can seek to prevent people from going on there. But
sounds to me like you'd accept a condition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, if somebody drives a 4x4 and they decide that they're going to park there, whatever, and they're going to ride up onto it, somebody may do it. But actually, there's a number of things that you can do that prevent 99% of people thinking, I'm going to go up in there and do it. So we can happily have a condition with that and discuss it with the officers.
Got it, Colin? I think you've been successful there, mate. I've got you, Robert, but there's a lot in front of you and you've already spoke, but I will certainly bring you in. Neil, Councillor Walshaw. Yeah. I'm sure they're very welcome to stay. You've asked, the panel have asked for them, so I'm not going to send them away. No, they'll be here for your next question. Neil, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'm sure the developers are not going anywhere. They're very aware of what a details oriented panel we are, and a bedding in for a long session, I think we can see. Thanks, Chair. It's interesting how times changed. This report mentions climate change a lot more than the Chancellor did yesterday, which was 0. Building on from Councillor Campbell's point, actually, what this report does highlight is what a changing environment we're operating in in terms of planning. So look at paragraphs 35 through to 42 regarding climate change. There's a question for developers, really. It's why do the first 50 dwellings, except you're probably going to get planning permission in fairly short order, I would imagine. What I'm interested to know is, and I appreciate the work that's gone in to try to future-proof this application, Stuart, I do, and it is a big improvement on what was before, and that's to be acknowledged, and thank you for that. What I'm curious to know is, why bother building the first 50 dwellings in the manner of paragraph 38, when actually the technologies and the materials for paragraphs 39 and 40 are already there, fit within your cost models, which is generally accepted in the industry. Because those first 50 buildings highlighted in paragraph 38 are going to need extensive retrofit in fairly short order. So isn't there the risk? Well, I don't see the point of doing it in the way that's set out. I think just start at paragraph 39 and build from that would seem entirely sensible, because there is, Chair, the problem that in a couple of years, lenders aren't going to lend for houses that aren't zero carbon, that new builds will just not get, prospective buyers will just not find a lender, because that's the way that the mortgage lending sector is going. It's going very quickly. So it is more of a question of philosophy and approach by the developer as to why not just go for 39 and 40 as an approach, which would be better for Councillor Finnegan's constituents, would be a premium product for Persimmon. And it seems somewhat nonsensical, I think. And because we're in this sort of period of rapid change, Chair, one of our dangers is that buildings are going to get permission that are going to need retrofitting almost before they're finished. And I just think philosophically, is that the right thing that the developer should be doing? I accept that this falls within the policy pathway we're in, but it does seem nonsensical, to be honest, Chair. And I'd just like to hear from the developer in whatever form what their response is to that. Because in your marketing materials, we've built these houses in Morley, we're building these houses in Morley. Oh, by the way, there's a £15,000-20,000 retrofit bill when you buy these houses, which are going to be expensive anyway. And it just seems to be a curious approach for a builder. But I fully acknowledge the work that's gone on, and I think there's an awful lot of progress being made. But it is curious, Chair, isn't it?
Can find out on that. We can find an answer to. But yeah, you're quite right. There's been an awful lot of progress, and this is possibly the greenest application we've looked at so far. They're on the right track, but a good question, and I guess it deserves an answer.
Thank you, Chair. There's sort of two options there, isn't there? One is you almost pause everything until the next Part L comes in, so that we know what's happening, because we don't know exactly what will be in there, and everyone's currently looking at how is the best way to comply with that, because you could do certain things and say, yes, that will comply, but is it the best way of doing it? And is it the way that in a couple of years you'll be doing it? And that's the preparation that's currently being done. So one option would almost be to sort of pause development for a couple of years until we exactly know what's happening, which I don't think is beneficial for anyone, because obviously that's got to be balanced with the huge housing need that exists at the moment. So the other option is, well, do you sort of take a leap of faith and do it now ahead of when it comes forward? But the danger of doing that is rushing into something that, yes, there are aspects that are highlighted in there, but actually we're just investigating those and looking at how they can be done, the best ways to come forward, so that you have a uniform approach to it and make sure it is the most efficient way to doing it. And I think, we are including PV on those early ones. We are looking at the reductions. We are in line with the policy. And I think sometimes actually using the time to prepare to get to where we're going to be, which is what's happening. As I said, there's these trial sites which are being looked at, measuring things, looking at it, looking at where supply can come and how you can deliver this on scale is something that's in action, but it's just not quite there yet, which is why the first 50 homes will be built as is this way, so that they can start as soon as possible and start to be filled and meet people's needs. But then we will be doing all of that preparation so that the other ones can come. And I note the point that the councillor is saying. However, we think that is the most appropriate way to do this.
I appreciate the answer, Stuart. I do, and I appreciate that, Martin Wilmore, you're not going to set Persimmon corporate policy on the hoof in the plans panel. No one's expecting you to do that. But we know what we need to do. We can't put it this way: you can't put on a par extra insulation and better quality windows with the Apollo program. it's not a leap of faith. It's things that we could do now, Chair. So I'm just expressing some frustration that we've got a developer coming forward who could easily build a very low impact development now. And it shouldn't be addressed. It shouldn't be put across that somehow this is some leap of faith, and that it's difficult, that it's, oh, so expensive, and we just don't know the technologies used. Codswallop. They absolutely do. They just don't want to do it because they absolutely don't have to. And it's a developer has made progress, but they're still doing the bare minimum when they can absolutely get away with the bare minimum. Anyway, it's just frustration, Chair, that's all.
That Councillor Walshaw, and I don't think there's any need to answer. They were comments, and you've already answered that. So moving on, we would all want more. We would all want better and more greener and more climate friendly. But I have to remind you as chair, you know yourself around this table, it's within policy. It's well within policy. Caroline, can I bring you in next?
Thank you, Chair. My questions have been covered, but I'd just like to push a couple of them a little bit further, if I may. The first one is about the school again. Paul, your explanation of how the school, a two-form entry school, works in terms of its intake made it quite clear that this particular development would not feed a two-form entry school, and that it would be relying quite heavily on schools on and around the area. Based on your understanding of both the formula and the existing schools around the area, how likely is it in real terms, do you think, that this school is going to actually be built or will need to be built? Because if in your estimation it's actually a very slight chance or possibly even no chance, then I think we can move on from the school agenda.
Thank you. So the school, the provision for the school was arranged back in around May 2017, and the request for the school site was made on the basis that this site was being brought forward ahead of the site that was intended to accommodate a school, I think HG 2150 at the time. So this site replaces or would replace the site allocation plan provision to meet all of demand from the Morley planning area. So this school was always seen as potentially required to be up to 2 forms of entry of demand from all sites within the site allocation plan to be brought forward in the Morley planning area. So the site alone would never have been never have yielded enough demand to fill the school on its own, regardless of the other projections. We would always have needed some inward movement. Since 2017, there has been a change in the outlook in terms of births across Leeds, actually across the country and across the world. Actually, there is in a lot of countries a reduction in the number of births now, and the UK is the same, and so is Leeds. So the current outlook in terms of demand for Morley is actually downward at the moment. So births have dropped about around 10% over the last year, and about 20% since 2017 when when negotiations were carried out around the school. So at the moment, the school looks less likely to be required in the near term than it was at that point. However, we would need to look at the actual yield that the demand that the site generates, in addition to any change in the birth rate over the next few years, before we'd be able to determine accurately whether or not the school was required. So I guess in answer at the moment, there's a question mark over it. I can't honestly say that looking at current projections that we could say for definite the school was required. But it would really depend on whether we see an uplift.
So I didn't ask for is it definite? I said how likely is it?
At the moment, looking at current projections and the current birth rate, it's unlikely that the school would be required as things stand. But there could be a change in the future, and we'd love to be able to have that option available to us.
Thank you. And the second question I had, refers to the CGIs that we've got in front of us. And my question is, how near to these CGIs will the build out actually look? Because I've looked at these in some detail against the layout on the first slide. And first of all, in street scene 3, we can see 4 houses and a tiny little bit of the row behind, but essentially 4 houses behind a patch of green. So, which means I think in real life, if I was standing in the middle of slide page 20, slide 20, I would only have 4 houses in my sight. And I don't feel that that's probably right. The second point to make is that on all these street scene examples that you've given us, they're set behind an attractive patch of green. And again, looking at the layout, there are many houses that will not be set adjacent to an attractive patch of green. And then we've got some rather nice, mature, pretty looking trees, partially obscuring the parked vehicles that are depicted in these street scenes as well. So my overall point is that not sometimes, quite often, when a scheme is built out, it really does not resemble the CGIs that we have been given, or it might resemble them in a very few instances from a very few vantage points. And finally, just a comment, which won't necessarily change people's view about this application, but I do feel that when we're talking about design and we're deciding, on types of sills and overhangs, and sills and heads and overhangs and eaves and roofs, I really think that our new design guidance suggests that we do a great deal more than those small adjustments on the existing boxes, and we actually think about contemporary design. I don't believe this does, but I do acknowledge the huge amount of work that officers have done, Mark, and I am very minded of your concluding remark in your presentation.
I think, Lewis, would you mind putting the CGIs right at the end? Were done to enhance those in light of the biodiversity improvements that have been made. So these CGIs, unfortunately, weren't as part of your presentation pack when they went to print. They don't show any new material. They show what you have seen before, but they show in a more true context what the biodiversity potentially looks like, and gives, although it's the focal point is a bit distant, it does give you the views into the site. I think as well, it's as members who on the site this morning, that the point was raised about what do a lot of these houses look out onto, and there's a lot more open space in this overall scheme than policy requirements require. But there's a lot of the layout has also ensured that there's various views from out onto the existing fields and beyond the site. So I very much appreciate Councillor Groon's point that there will be streets where they look out onto each other, but the housing density has been dropped by 100 houses over the outline consent, and as a result of that has opened up the site and given more views onto open spaces and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And is that all right, or would you like to hear from the developers?
I'd like to hear from the developers,
Okay.
please, on this.
Let's do
if I
that.
may.
You can come back, Danny, should you need to.
Thank you. I think the point of a number of the CGIs is discussions have taken place about where was the character drawn from, and I think it does create its own character. But one of the key aspects of this has been mentioned a few times is the open space. There is a very green feel to this site when you look at those large areas of open space, and even the first CGI that was on with the 4 properties that you questioned is actually a perpendicular roads with a quadrant of open space that actually looks through to the school at the back of it. So you would actually only see those 4 properties from that area around that little pocket area. So a number of the points of the CGIs were to actually sort of highlight the open space that's on there, because we think that is a key component of the site. And yes, whilst there will be some runs of properties and there will be some back-to-back in a more traditional form, which is exactly what you find on the the schemes either side of this site. Actually, the CGIs have sort of focused on that to identify that there will be quite a lot of greenery within this and open space, formal open space, but informal open space as well, particularly with those wilder areas in the past. Yeah, and equally, I think the landscape consultant would just like to add.
The views are from computer generated basic drawings from key locations. It's true that they don't show planting in year one. What would the point of that be? It would give you no idea of what the design concept is behind it. But I have here the locations, and if you want.
Can I just say, Tom, though, we couldn't possibly see that from here. Do you need that up on the screen? And we can do that, I think, can't we, Mark?
I'm not sure that colleagues will necessarily benefit from going into any more detail at this point, but my point still is that these street scenes will not necessarily be what strike you when you walk into the built out development, as far as I can tell from the responses that we've had.
Well, that would depend upon where you walk in.
To put it another way, if you walk through the estate and around the estate, you will not be greeted with these scenes on every step. You will be greeted with more scenes that are very different.
Can we move on? Barry, I've got you next.
Just quickly to return back to the school site, if it's not required, has agreement been reached as to what will happen to the land? You've got 10 years, haven't you, to make a decision, isn't it? And after the 10 years, what happens to the land? Is it referring back to the developer? Is it being gifted to the community? Will it fall to the residents to increase their management charge? What's happening if, after 10 years, the school site is not to be used? Has any agreement been reached as to what will happen? I've got a number of other questions, but if you want to do that one first. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to say Paul as well, but just so the section 106, I'll just briefly, the section 106 says on the 240th house has to be offered up to the education authority.
Yeah.
On the chief planning officer's recommendation, there is a condition that until those houses are built, the actual details of how that will be left will be submitted for approval. So, i.e., so we can secure a visual amenity, so it isn't just a parcel of land that's visually an eyesore. As to so it will incorporate, just further planting grass, and that can be part of the condition that's proposed. Paul, if I could ask you to answer what happens in the event that we don't have the requirement for it. What is the mechanism in terms of it going back to the developer, or if I could.
Thanks. I don't think I can honestly answer it, but what I can say is that the land doesn't actually transfer over to the local authority unless we request that to happen. So it would be negotiated at market rate, I believe, if we wanted to purchase that land to construct the school. But we have that offer open in line with the terms of the S106 agreement. But if we don't take up that offer, then I'm not sure what the position would be with the land.
Thank you. So in terms of if it's then the developer, we would have to look at an application that would have to be brought forward by the applicant, or it might be left as it is in perpetuity. But that is something that we would have to, the developer would have to look at further. But there is the condition there to make sure that it's integrated until at that point that we know whether it gets the requirements there for the school.
Yeah, I just think if we could get some better safeguards for that. For example, in my ward, there's an example of this happening, and the developer has agreed, or at least on half of that particular site, because it's two different developers. I've got the school site, one of them is willing to gift it back to the community at zero cost, so that the community can then build it into whatever it is they want it to do. And I just think it's to get, because it's future-proofing it, because someone's going to have to deal with it. And I don't, well, unless maybe we've got some great plans that enforcement will suddenly become the greatest department that this council ever had. But I don't think many of us have got much confidence that whatever is agreed that they will actually be enforced against, and you could end up having conflicts, because by the time this happens, these houses, some of these houses will be sold for the third time by 10 years in terms of turnover, because that's the way that new people stay in them for 2 or 3 years. They then sell them on, etc., etc. So it could be very difficult for the forthcoming, unless they've got something to fall back on, something in their deeds. But anyway, I've made the point. You mentioned TROs. Are the TROs going to be implemented up front, or is it that you're getting funding to implement the TROs if the school site goes ahead? Or are they going to be done in from day one, put in place from day one?
Yeah, we wouldn't put them in from day one. There'd be TROs, but there'd also be school keep clear markings, and they wouldn't be appropriate. So it would be the funding.
Right. So you might have conflict with the residents who have moved in, because again, will the developer be marketing the houses here, saying you might be overlooking a school if you purchase this? Because how many times on development sites do people come along and say, well, nobody told me there was going to be a school here, and all of a sudden they've got a school here. And it does have a difference. It might be nice for the kids just to run out at 1 minute to 9 in the morning and still arrive at 9 o'clock. I accept that might be one good point, but I've got some worries about that. Right. If we can move on to page 5 and page 13, coming back to the point I was making on site, it would appear by looking at that, at least 2 houses appear to be on the almost outside of where the bollards are going to go, if this diagram has been drawn correctly. So if you look at the one on it's page 5, map 3, and you go up to the very top above the 7, you go up above the 7, there are 2 properties past the hatched, or well, what looks like a hatched, or if it's might just be text that's on it. And then if you look at the same one on page 7, again, it looks as though there are 2 houses above where you would logically put the bollards. How are they going to get there? And then to follow up from that, what have you looked at the phasing here? Because if all of a sudden these houses along the top get built first, people might get used to coming out of the non-entrance, because you won't have put the bollards in at day 1. So people will get it by custom and practice. And then on the presumption that in 10 years' time, Councillor Finnegan is still Councillor Finnegan, he's going to get residents saying, well, I've done this for the last 10 years and now you're suddenly closing it off. What are you going to do now to keep it open? And that was not the intention of the planning application. So how are you going to ensure that that scenario does not occur? Because I can assure you it does occur, that when you try to do one thing, you don't do it immediately, residents then say, well, I've been quite happy driving out of this way, I want to continue doing so. How do you safeguard that one? And if the truth be told, most of you have come across that in your own wards as well. So
we've also come across householders who maintain the green grass in front of it and do it and look after it, haven't we?
Yeah.
I mean, let's have a round of discussion on it.
Oh yeah, look. But how are you going to ensure that? How are you going to ensure that?
So on the outline planning permission, there was a pre-commencement condition regarding the emergency access. So the details of that will mean that we can ensure that the bollard is put in prior to the commencement of the entire scheme, so that there won't be the future reviews this access issue. So
So the
hopefully
bollards will be put up at the
there's a
beginning,
condition on the outline consent.
and there will be no construction traffic using that entrance in order to get in and out of the site at that particular location.
In terms of construction traffic, there's conditions on regarding the management plans. So again, that would have to be looked at the time of it
Okay,
being
all right.
controlled. But
I mean,
there's conditions there to ensure
I've
that
given
those
Councillor
points are-
Finnegan some thoughts to potential areas. The next one is, and it was following up on the point that Councillor Walshaw made, in terms of, and I totally 100% agree, that I was going to ask the question in terms of what has the developer volunteered to comply with in terms of our emerging policy changes, so that we can build, because otherwise someone's going to have to pick up the bill for the retrofitting. So is there any way, if they're not, that we can get a fund from them so that when the houses are not in compliance, can be drawn down so that they can then comply when the new standards are there? Otherwise, it will fall to Leeds City Council to have to find the money to retrofit these houses, because very, very quickly it's going to be happening, because we need to retrofit vast majority, if not all of the houses in this city. And this is some that would be less, that would go further down the list, and the funding could then be used elsewhere, because otherwise it'll fall. So can we have a fund? Is it legally possible to get a fund from the developer that can be set aside to retrofit when they get to the next higher standards?
Unfortunately not, because the outline consent dealt with our policy requirements, and as Chair said earlier, it is a policy compliant scheme, so there would be nothing that we could enter a further legal agreement, because the legal agreement was written at the outline consent, and in this respect the policy has been complied with regards to the EN1 and EN2. So unfortunately.
Okay, so you are confirming that there might be around about 150 houses might be built by the time these new standards come in, and you are saying on behalf of the council that the council accept that they would need to try and find some funding in order to retrofit those houses through some method, either going to the government or from their own resources.
I can't confirm when they will be built.
But at 50 a year, and it's going to take 3 years to start getting to some of those standards, that's roughly 150 houses.
But if the housing, as they've in the document and what they've put forward, they're saying that the projections are that they'll obviously have to meet the building regs requirements of those times. So it will, but they're saying I'm explaining that it meets the policy, and they're going beyond that. And in terms of when the houses are built out, that is something that the developer would be able to answer. But
I made the point. And the final thing is, because we're getting almost near enough to 2030 by the time some of these houses are going to be built out, what happens if electricity has gone by the wayside and hydrogen's taken over? Because, well, but the point is, that we're giving agreement just now that every house is going to have an electric point outside it, which I agree with as of today. It's how do we make sure that, because they're still building new houses out, they'll be quite able to build them with electric points, but there might actually be the demand for some other technology. Because I remember back to the site allocations plan when we were discussing these types of things, and the developers didn't want electric points being put in at day one. Never mind doing it now, they've done it now, but they argued at the inquiry that I was at that there should be no guarantee that electric points be put in. That was their argument that they made at the time, rightly or wrongly. So how are you going to ensure that Councillor Finnegan does not have problems in his area in the future?
I think the applicant rightly pointed out earlier on, this is why at the moment they are investigating which are the most feasible and what will be most deliverable. So at this moment in time, it's policy compliant, And there will be ways that they're making sure that they're investigating it thoroughly enough so that they can bring online what is going to be best for future, so that you're not in a position where hydrogen cars, for instance, will probably be the next big climate emergency push. And that's why, but this is all in the future, and that's what the developer, the applicant, has tried to address earlier. And I feel that comment is all.
I think we just have to remind ourselves that we're looking at the application before us. We can't second guess where anything that's going to happen in the future. Going back to what Mark has said a number of times, it meets existing policies. We can't foolproof everything. And the council aren't very good at retrofitting, because it seems to me that we had loads of private flats built in this city that had cladding on. And the council certainly hasn't come to the rescue on it. They're dependent on the government on that type of thing. So, you know, let's concern ourselves with the report and the policies that we actually have in force.
If it's the affordable, someone's going to have to pick it up.
Yep. Did you want a quick word?
It was just to come back on the EV charging points. I mean, commercial, the market already had electric vehicles at that point. We've got, as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of commercial activity in relation to hydrogen cars as yet. So I think that would be sort of going far beyond what we can do reasonably as a planning authority. I mean, as we know, at the cost strategy review, we did incorporate EV charging points because that was an existing technology within the market and vehicles were available at that point, whereas there's no market for those at the moment in terms of hydrogen.
Thanks, Marty. Dan, please, can you come in now?
I was desperately trying to come up with a question about where we're going to get the carport for the levitating cars, which I'm assuming that's been built into this a la Jetsons for future proofing. Now, I just want some clarification because it's been brought up a couple of times. Am I correct in my belief that it is not open to us to revisit in any way, shape or form the fact that there is only one entry to this development? My understanding is, because it's been mentioned a couple of times, that that is not something under any way, shape or form that we are allowed to revisit.
Yeah, I think Mark's already, as you say, it's already confirmed that this not on the table today. That was dealt with at the outline stage. That was approved at the outline stage. And this is very much looking at the details as set out in terms of reserve matters of landscaping, design, access and layout, not access, layout and appearance. So therefore it is set at that point. It's very difficult for us looking at these particular details to now seek to revisit that. Well, virtually it's impossible, should I say.
It's all right. I was picking up on the very difficult. I want a categorical. It cannot be done or it can be done. It's one or the other, and highways seem to have a slightly different view.
I haven't got a different view, I don't think, but there's been no change in our policy position since the outline stage that would mean that, in my opinion, that we could revisit that issue. Therefore, it's not a matter for this reserve matters.
Well, just following on from that last point, I was here at the outline when we discussed the outline application, and a great deal of concern was expressed that there was only one entry into the estate. So I'm a bit surprised now to find that the emergency entrance has now been closed to people accessing the estate. And we've got 450 houses there. And what it means is that traffic will be driving around estate streets. It has to do. And we really want to cut that down. So that wasn't the question I was going to ask, but I just had to say that we were concerned. So how has this been given outline permission? So that's, if you want to answer that, fine. But I've got another question to ask.
For that, Mark?
I wasn't, no, but I would just say it was outline planning consent was granted on that basis. But in terms of what we've achieved here, which goes beyond that, is creating infrastructure that is a much bigger road, and what we're bringing from the original plan that was in front of you in July. This is the spinal road is significantly bigger. So I just add that into the mix, but it was approved at outline.
Can I say at outline, it was up to 550 houses. It's been reduced to 450 now. Did you have another question?
I do, but firstly, I don't accept that. I was here and I heard it said, and I accept that there's been a wider road being provided, but I'm very disappointed that the panel's views were not reflected in the outline permission. Right, the question that I've been waiting to ask is that I heard what the developers say about the design of the houses following the most, I was going to say ergonomic, the most fuel efficient, the most, so that there isn't an escaping of heat, no fancy bits apart from the sills around the windows and the doors being rather different. But if you look on page 21 and then page 22, where you see these brick houses, I think they look poor. It's rather like the Bauhaus group form following function. And I'd like to know what can be done to improve the appearance of these houses. And I don't accept that it's a character of their own. And I think I've always said unrelieved brick is boring, and that is unrelieved.
In terms of the design, we've the design has been discussed at length with the applicant and with urban design colleagues, and the design approach in terms of the individual houses is considered to be a good quality design. There's conditions on the approval, on any approval, and on the outline consent to make sure that the quality of materials is appropriate, and that will be what makes the scheme, is the quality of the scheme, quality of the materials, but also, as we keep touching on, the lengths, the setting of the housings is just as important. And in this particular case, the layout and the setting of all of the open spaces and the biodiversity improvements is, in terms of at the moment, the site doesn't hardly have any hedgerows. There's a significant, nearly 2,000 meters of hedging, which will provide a setting to the houses. And it's collectively, the design approach is considered to be acceptable and of a high quality.
Well, I've heard everything now. The design of a house depends on whether there's a hedge around it. That's ridiculous. Well, that's what it amounted to. These houses look boring. They are bland and they are dull. And the question I've asked, what can be done to improve them? Some of the houses have got render on, which relieves the uniformness of it. But I can go on to make comments, but I already have had a lot. But my question is, what can be done to improve this?
Liz, you know, and I know that we all have different opinions. I do notice that the doors are the entrance doors are where you prefer them. You don't like to see two in the middle next to each other. So that's an improvement. Can I invite you in to make a comment, please? Because I'm not sure where we're going on this.
Thank you, Chair. The doors on the outside are a deliberate positioning there on request of office as well. You'll be glad to know. The design of this, we've talked about it a few times that this is a reserved matters. So it's looking at the layout, the appearance, the scale and the landscaping. And the outline application was accompanied by a very detailed design and access statement. It was about 50 pages long, and it went through a number of iterations with officers looking at a broad layout, which is very similar to what we have, a street hierarchy, an opportunity for where the parking will go, how the properties will be done in terms of their scale, the materials, the mix, the densities, the house types, etc. And as part of that, it looks taking the character of there. And this application has actually gone beyond that in terms of where it was. I think it's been talked about a few times that there's been a number of iterations of this, and we've worked very carefully with the design officers that the scheme has evolved with the council's changing aspirations for design and where things go. And a key component of that would be parking, whereby to begin with, the first application had a number of parking spaces to the front of the properties, which the officers have pushed to the side of the properties and moved back. And that's come along with the reduction in the number of homes, etc. And as you can say, it ensures that there isn't that car dominant. Now, what design policies tell us to look at are to look at the character of the area, look at the surrounding areas, and that again comes into matters of scale, density, etc. And then also we shouldn't create things that harm areas. When there was a comment earlier about where would the design ideas been taken from, we heard reference to things like Victorian houses here, and it shows that there are ages when homes came forward. And what we tried to do here is to bring it into sort of an urban contemporary element so that it creates that character area of itself, because it's 550 homes. It's not looking at doing a pastiche of something. Equally, it's drawing on things that are nearby for it to look at. But I think what the officer was trying to say is that it's looking at the design as a whole. The design isn't just necessarily the 4 properties that are on screen at the moment. It's the setting, it's the density, it's that open space. But again, I note the comments that Councillor Nash has just talked about. There are properties that have rendering that break it up. The site itself has 3 different character areas. So it isn't just brickwork throughout. It isn't just render throughout. Actually, as you transition from one area into another, you'll notice different densities, different house types, different massing and different materials, so that it does start to break up those character areas. So on the whole, as the chair said, look, design is very subjective to different people. One person may like render, one person may like brick, one person may like stone. We have to look at it in the round, and we have to look at scale. There's been an awful lot of effort put in with officers to look at this, and the design officers, to get something that moves on where it was originally. And we think we've come up with a really well-designed, laid out scheme that actually has some variation in there, good fenestration, chimneys on properties, which you sometimes don't see. And we think that it addresses this large site in a suitable manner.
Can we move on then? And I've got Al, please. Councillor Garthwaite.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions. First of all, you just mentioned chimneys, and I wondered why some of them have got chimneys and some haven't. And I don't understand the phrase chimneys to focal houses. Could you please clarify?
Yes, again, I think it's just to look at those different character areas and break up the street scene so that not every property is uniform, not everyone has chimneys. Well, you can see on the screen that's in front of us there, it shows the breakup along the street side, and the focal areas will probably be corner properties, key vistas, that type of thing. So again, it just draws something different to the eye and provides it.
I see. Okay, thank you. And the other one is about safety. I see in paragraph 68, designing out crime, it really focuses on crime as in theft, burglary, as opposed to what might happen to someone who's walking perhaps from one house to another at night, or coming into the area having got off a bus, or walking through the access road. And could you please clarify what measures will be taken to ensure that people are as safe as they possibly can, and moreover, not just are as safe, but can perceive it as a safe area? And particularly also, while the building is going on, you mentioned that 50 houses would be built and filled, and then the rest of the site would carry on over time. How will they feel that they are safe, and indeed be safe, from all sorts of different threats that might occur?
Thank you, Councillor. I think when you ask that question to most people, they'll immediately go lighting and say that we're going to put lighting in. And there's a great book written by a lady called Jane Jacobs who looked at this. And she highlighted the fact, where would you feel more safe? In an area underneath a lamppost with nothing else and nobody around you, or sat in a cinema where there's no lighting whatsoever but lots of other people? I think that's the key element to this, that it's all about having eyes on the street and having areas that other people have and people can see it. And you can see from a lot of those open spaces that they're actually looking at routes between places, so that you will get cyclists, you will get pedestrians and people using them, but they're actually overlooked by properties as well. So that actually, as you're using those spaces, you can see other properties are looking onto it, so that you don't have that feeling of exposure, that there's nobody else there. So actually it provides it. And I think that can come together with landscaping as well, so that you don't create high boundaries around walkways so that people can't be seen. So it immediately gives you that feeling of safety. That can then be combined with lighting, so that actually it is open and that you don't have these dark areas. So it's a really interesting point, something that is often looked at with these, and we maybe don't talk about it often enough, because it does get factored in. So it's ensuring that the first 50, as you mentioned, the way that the phasing will go is that the 50 are actually very close together. So you don't have them in a long line where if you're the 50th house away from everybody, nobody else knows what's going on. They will actually be in a cluster on the northwestern corner. So again, you have people immediately near to you so that they can see what's going on.
Okay.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. I think I've said this before, but it would have been useful if that had actually been included in the description previously, so I didn't have to ask it. But thank you. I'm happy, and I agree with what you say about lighting. People do say that, and yet it creates pools of total darkness outside of the light, which is actually less safe in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. It's a question regarding safety that you always raise, and you're quite right to do so. Moving on, I've got Robert. Robert, they're still here, Robert. They haven't gone for a coffee. You're okay.
No, I'm still here, still fascinated by what's been said, and for the first time, agree with Councillor Walshaw on something, that it is Codswallop. But leaving that aside, I know it's dangerous, new area for me, but you may well be right on this occasion. Right, 2 questions for the developer. If we agree 450 houses under EN1 at this particular point, based upon what EN1 says today, you're under no planning obligations to do anything more, regardless of what else changes. If we come up with a new EN1 next year, or in 2 years' time, or in 5 years' time, whatever it might actually be, you can go for the minimum, which is what we've agreed at this particular point. Planning regulations may change, government legislation may change, but at this particular point, under your planning obligations, if we agree 450 under EN1, all you have to do is hit EN1 as it stands today on those 450 properties. So that's one question. Second question is, if, as my Children's Services colleague has suggested or implied, that there might not be a need for a school, and we're going to come to him in a moment, how many houses can you get on 1.8 hectares, which is the space that you'd have? Because my view is, if they don't come up with a school at that particular location, you'll come back with an application to say more houses on that particular point. So I'd like to know the numbers. So that's for the developer. In terms of Children's Services, 2003, some of your colleagues briefed me and Councillor Ledley at that particular point about falling birth rates at that particular stage, and you decided that Sure will go from a 3-form entry down to a 2-form entry. Your colleagues came along in about 2013 and said, actually, we've got those figures wrong and the birth rate's spiralling at this particular point. Asquith Primary needs to go from a 1-form entry to a 2-form entry to expand, to include those extra children. Last decade, we've had somewhere in the region of 1,500 houses on greenfield sites in Morley, and I agree with your figures, the 0.25 per household at that particular point. That's 300 extra kids in the area that wouldn't have been in this particular area. If we add on the 113, and I agree with your figures, the numbers that will be generated at this particular site, that's 400 and, according to my figures, 400 odd kids. How do we not need a new primary school based upon that, and based upon the fact that your predictions in the past haven't been entirely accurate? Thank you.
Sorry, shall we start with that one, Paul? And we'll go on to policy. There's Mark here and John there can talk about the policy side of it.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, well, I will just start by saying that the expansion of Asquith and the Chairwell decision will be before I joined the team, so I'm not aware entirely of the circumstances then. However, knowing the Morley planning area as I do, I believe we've had sufficient capacity in the system to be able to absorb the housing generated demand today and the general population growth as well, in addition to that over the sort of previous 10 years, without requiring any additional places. I mean, that's sort of played out in terms of the allocations and the fact that we do operate generally in Morley with a small amount of surplus capacity available, which is within the limits of what we would want in an area to allow for in-year movement as well. The change going forward is, as I've already said, is the birth rate, which is based on factual NHS data, which is provided to us from NHS Leeds and NHS Bradford, and is then broken down into the planning area levels that we plan by, and that indicates or shows a reduction in births coming through, which will hit in Morley around 2024 and 2025, but there has been some reduction since 2017 onwards, when we saw the plateau around the high point in Leeds generally. So the figures are what they are really. They do suggest that we will be seeing at the moment an increase in surplus capacity in Morley, as well as a lot of other parts of the city coming through from around 23-24 onwards. And we will monitor that. If there's any uptick in births, then that will obviously change the view again, but we can only work on the data that we get and then translate that into forecasts. So previous forecasts will have included that housing growth where housing is under construction and it is put into projections, and that will have eaten up some of the surplus in Morley and kept the schools fuller than they otherwise would have been. Please.
So regarding how many schools could you get on that parcel of land, I think you need houses. Sorry.
It's been a long afternoon.
Apologies. How many houses you could get on that parcel of land that's allocated for the school? It should be, I should just clarify again that the outline planning permission was for 550 houses. So looking at the density of the site as a whole, in terms of looking at the future of that site, if the school doesn't come forward, that would, as I think I might have touched on earlier, would be an issue that would need to look at what the developer proposes at that point in time, and we'd have to assess it on the current local and national policies, and that would be something that we obviously can't comment on, because we'd have to have a look at what the housing supply needs of the city and the area are at that moment in time. So I hope that answers that. But ultimately it would need planning permission that would need to be look at all issues at that moment in time.
Me again, Chair. My regular comment that not for nothing are we worth value for money for the people of Leeds with the detail we've got into this afternoon. Chair, this is more of a comment than a question. Are we moving on to comments, Chair?
Are you wishing to make a comment?
I am, yes.
I'll put you down first then.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Walsh was slightly premature there. Colleagues will be aware, I say colleagues, some colleagues will be aware that on the 16th of March 2017, this matter, the outline matter, was determined by this plans panel. And indeed, Councillor Garthwaite and Councillor Anderson, along with yourself, Chair, I think were the, Councillor Campbell as well, who had a motion defeated on this application at that meeting, were the only colleagues that were there at that meeting. I think, Liz. I'll check in a sec. But I would like to read part of the minutes for that, because it's quite relevant. In response to members' comments and questions, the following were discussed. Access into the site was not ideal. A second access point required pursuing. Could officers just speak to us about how, when it was then delegated, how that requirement by the members of that panel was incorporated into the decision?
I'm pretty sure I was at the panel, but I mean, you know, the highways officers did object to this application when it first came in on the basis of one means of access only. As I said earlier, we tried every which way to get that second means of access, and there wasn't one forthcoming that was safe and deliverable. So that position was put to the panel. I certainly wasn't I haven't got the minutes in front of me, but I wasn't aware that any minutes suggested that it wasn't to be approved if that second means of access couldn't be delivered. I don't recall that either.
Thanks. You did, Chair, and I'm sure as well as always. Councillor Walshaw, I think, made a really important point. And I say this genuinely without any levity. He said, this panel gives Leeds real value for money. Well, Chair, that's true, we do. But if we say something unequivocally, we're only giving value for money if officers then translate that into the decisions they then make. A second access point required pursuing is fairly unequivocal. That's what was minuted. Those are the minutes that were approved. I'm happy for us to come back with a more detailed explanation at a future meeting, but it would seem to me that a fairly unequivocal direction from this panel may not have been incorporated into an outline permission. And that concerns me greatly.
We've been talking.
Yeah, I think just thinking about it further, clearly there was a resolution to grant on the plans that were in front of panel at that point, and it may have been in relation, the discussion may have been in relation to an emergency access, a second means of access for emergency vehicles, so that the minutes may not have expanded to that point, but the decision would have been made on the plans in front of panel, as it is every time.
Yeah.
And clearly the chair
I
recalls
mean,
that.
Sorry, members were aware that there was only going to be one access. We were aware of the emergency would be unsuitable unless there was demolition of nearby properties to get the site sprays, as Julian has outlined. But I just have to remind you that we did pass it on that ground. You know, now the minutes you brought up, it may have been a comment by a member. I don't know. I can't explain it without looking back on it. But the members did accept one entrance because they felt the roadwork within the estate was robust enough to handle the traffic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to sort of lay to rest something which has bothered me to some extent. Talking about design, it is possible when looking at an estate to say, yes, that was built by X or by X. Persimmon have a sort of look about them. Other developers have a look about them. Would you please, hand on heart, tell me that design in your case means designing houses for a particular plot or site, as opposed to picking the designs that you have and saying that's probably the most appropriate for here?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, house types get a bit of a bashing by being designed already and being brought onto sites, but on some sites they are appropriate and you can use them. And what usually happens is a base, those house types will form it, but then you can tweak those and you can amend them to look at certain areas. Because if you just took the exact same site to every single plot, you wouldn't get planning permission very often, because you have to look at the form and you have to look at the character. I mean, in terms of this site, The outline application, I mentioned they had a very detailed design and access statement, so that we actually started looking at these elements right back at the outline stage. It's about 50 pages long. It has indicative street scenes in it, talked about road hierarchies, layouts, and it also looked at key vistas, key points, corner turners, etc. So that all of those had to be attributed to when the reserve matters came in. So that this application has then taken all of those aspects of it and brought them in to look at it, so that it has a whole range of different house types, varieties. And I think on this site, they have been amended in line with discussions so that they meet those bespoke requirements. And I think the officer's report references the word bespoke. Our view definitely is that they have been, because these are properties that we've taken ultimately, houses need windows at the front and back and a front door, and they need certain rooms to be included within them. And you build around that to look at the character of the area. So the heights have changed in some of them, the roof pitches, the inclusion of chimneys, some of the fenestration details, the gaps between them, the brick detailing above the windows, etc., have all been brought into this site through discussions with the officers. They're not just brought off the shelf, as it were, and put into a layout. They've been worked through with them. So yes, they're not standardized house types. They have been designed and looked at how they fit into this site.
Thank you as far as it goes. But what you've really said to me is that, yes, we do have designs and we tweak them effectively. So that, the basic shape of a house doesn't really change unless you put a chimney on it. And I get boring about chimneys, so we won't go into that at the moment. But apart from to thank you for having put some chimneys on some of these houses. But, you haven't sat down with a blank paper and said, for Cherwell, this is what we want to build. And you've actually tweaked designs that you already have.
So apologies, I didn't mean to give that impression, because I was just giving an introduction as to how that may work on some sites. So on this site, the designers have looked at the site, the layout, the size of the properties that will fit into them, the 2, 3s and 4 beds. The external alterations have been changed. They're not standardized house types. So yes, we did start with we didn't start with a blank piece of paper. We started with effectively the design and access statement, because that identified what we should be looking at doing and where the home should go on it. So, and some of these properties may be found on other sites, may be used on other sites in the future. But again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that property could be, we believe is acceptable, and it could be acceptable in another location. Equally, that property may not be acceptable in another location, therefore you wouldn't use it, and you would alter the house types and do them. So they're not just standardized properties brought from another site within Leeds or a different area and put onto this site. They have been individually considered as to appropriate designs, appropriate layouts, and suitable properties that go on here, taking into account the surrounding area, the density, interactions with the properties within the site and the open space.
Thank you. I won't pursue it any further.
Thanks, Graham. I think we've drifted into comments now. So Neil, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, we've gone over this in quite some detail. As an application, it demonstrates really, I appreciate members have still some outstanding concerns with matters that were, to be frank, largely decided in 2017. It is illustrative of the utility of plans panels, I believe, Chair. I mean, this application has come on an awful long way, and that needs to be acknowledged, particularly in the areas that I'm especially interested, as you might imagine, which is climate and energy, amongst other things. And I think that's got to be acknowledged. Made my comments about where I wish this application was in terms of what the applicant could do, but I acknowledge that we're in a transitional period, Chair. I think it's fair to say, with respect to a lot of policy. So at least this represents some progress. So without wanting to curtail debate, Chair, I would be minded to move the recommendations at an appropriate juncture.
Next.
Thanks, Chair. Two comments have been made by the colleagues this afternoon, which I entirely would agree with. Codswallop, my good colleague across the way, and Narnia, which is another colleague towards my left at this particular point, because we're in a sort of weird and wonderful fantasy world that we're finding ourselves in at this particular point. It'll come as no surprise to people that I don't believe that this site is sustainable at a point where you have a legal break on the number of houses that are being built because you need provision of a further primary school, at a point where the one road in and one road out breaches our own policy. That's all it's supposed to be for up to 199 houses. At a point where you can't guarantee the safety of vehicles that might be egressing down the emergency route, then it clearly isn't sustainable. But the interesting thing, I think, is to examine really the impacts on CO2 emissions, something that Councillor Walsh or Councillor Cargill are fascinated with. And let's just revisit those figures just so that we can help and assist with this particular debate. At this stage, this site is absorbing CO2, 118 metric tonnes per year. Granting planning permission for this will lead to 36,000 metric tonnes of CO2 being produced to build the houses. Even if we accept the specification, and this is according to the Committee on Climate Change, this is their figures, not mine, by 2030, even with all of the planning rules and regulations that are likely to change at that particular point, you'll be generating 80 metric tonnes of CO2 a year, year in and year out. So you've got a site that at this particular point is contributing positively towards net zero by 2030, something that all of us voted for at this particular point. If you grant planning permission at this particular stage, and that clearly undermines it, it's got to undermine it. You can't have both. You can't have net zero by 2030 and hand over a site that is presently absorbing CO2, which will produce thousands and thousands of tons of CO2. That cannot be sustainable in any shape, way, or form. Now, I find some solace, as I know a lot of people do, with Boris Johnson, who talks about young families need houses in the UK, not on greenfield sites, but beautiful homes on brownfield sites. Well, this is clearly not a brownfield site. People who visited it at this particular point will know that it is very much a greenfield site. So at this particular point, we're in a bit of a dilemma. Do we say that we support the provision of housing on brownfield sites or not? Do we say we believe in a zero target by 2030, or do we not? Is it all empty rhetoric, or ultimately are we prepared to support what we actually say? And on that grounds, and the grounds that the fact that this is not a sustainable site, I clearly won't be voting for it. Thanks, Chair.
Tom, just look, Councillor Grew next. I've got you down.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say that despite the comments that I've made so far and the questions that I've asked, which have expressed some disappointment, I've got to say, particularly in the design and layout, which, you know, are in front of us now, and listening very carefully to Robert's rationale, I've got sympathy with it, Robert, but the bottom line is we do need to build houses, and this is in front of us now. And I have to acknowledge that it's probably the greenest application for housing development that we've had put in front of us. And on that basis, I do think it's very difficult to turn down. So I would support and second Councillor Warshaw's recommendation for the proposal. Having said that, I really do hope that we are going to move on to much greater things in terms of modern urban design, because I know these developers have got their hands on some very desirable sites that will be coming our way.
Thank you, Caroline. Peter, please. Peter Cullen.
Thanks, Chair. I'll carry on in a similar vein. I think what the problem is, we're not deciding here which is the best design of houses we'd like to see on this particular site. We're deciding whether the application in front of us fits the legal planning framework. Obviously, this isn't the most beautiful estate I'd like to live in the area, but it meets. I personally don't have much. I don't find the design offensive, I wouldn't say. I don't find it the most beautiful design I've ever said, but there are houses there that I think are much more attractive than ones we've granted very recently, probably, and not gone into this depth. And I think that would be unfair not to point that out. And similarly, on the grounds of carbon, you could argue we shouldn't build anything ever. Yeah. that could be a ground you build, or certainly build nothing unless it is built out of carbon neutral complete development. But as you well know, that is not within the legal planning policy framework at the moment. What we have got here, and members all know exactly where I am on this agenda, and I would love to be where you are on it, but you referenced Boris, and maybe we could call on him and ask whether the national planning policy framework needs to move further on this. And that's where we'll get to when this developer has to make those changes. They will, and that's what we've seen they are going to do over time, and we'll get there. So what I'll accept here is what we're seeing is a progression from probably only 5 years ago that we'd have seen something completely different, and we've now seen something with a marketable improvement. I'm happy that we're progressing on this phase. I'd like to see where we are in another 5 years' time, because I think that'll get there. I don't necessarily think the legal planning policy framework has moved as fast as I'd like it to, but there are no grounds that I see that I could refuse this, that are legal planning policy grounds based on the other determinations we've made at this panel, and based on that being a consistent approach. So I'm happy to support this. I will make one slight then comment, because I think Colin's comment originally around the grass verges and the protection of them was one that was discussed at length at the last meeting, and it's a shame that we didn't get something coming back, because segregation in terms of the cycleway is segregation, i.e. you would let your small child cycle along it, safe in the knowledge that they won't come across another motor vehicle in that path. And I think in this case, the likelihood of a nice wide verge, and I've got many of them in my lovely green ward out in the outskirts of the city that have tyre marks in them, as I'm sure many of our other colleagues have. And so I think we do need to look in that. I think that's something that we would like to see conditioned in many going forward, if we were to say that's a safe segregated cycleway. But based on the planning policies we have at present and the national planning policies that we have at present, there are no legal grounds I see for us to refuse this particular application.
Thank you, Peter. Well said. Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Varley said something interesting earlier on for me, which was he said it's not a disaster. I've been fairly consistent on this panel. I believe everybody that lives in our city is entitled to the best designed property. And I don't believe these are the best designed properties. I think there is more mileage in terms of the aesthetic and the overall quality of design. Whatever reservations I may have about lots of aspects of this development are frankly irrelevant at this stage, because they are determined and determined beyond question, and I accept that. The principle of design, the principle of development, the access, all of that is determined and decided. But on the issue of the actual appearance, one of the 4 things we are here to determine today, I still have issues. I don't think they are good enough. And so I have no problem with the overall layout, the scale, but the appearance for me is still problematic. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Dan. Kaylee, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think most of my views have already been said, especially Councillor Carlisle. I'd like to echo his thoughts that he shared with us about we're basically sat here to determine the design aspect, and the question that I asked earlier regarding the access. I do apologise for raising it, because it was a bit of a can of worms, wasn't it? But I do think it's a flawed application, but it was a flawed application in 2017 and was passed on balance by this panel before I was even elected and before I sat on city plans. And I have to trust past councillors who sat on this panel, that they made the best decision with the policies that were in front of them at the time. So it's kind of with a heavy heart really that I have to support this. I agree fully with Councillor Cohen that we should require better design, but I think at the moment we don't have the tools to ask for it. So, but yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Kaylee. Never apologise for asking a relevant question. It was relevant and officers are here to explain the reasoning behind it. Thank you. Liz, finally.
Oh, you coming back in, are you? I did that.
Well, I don't mind if people come back, a follow up from what they were saying, but we've heard from Councillor Finnegan that basically he doesn't want this scheme at all. Now, it is in the SAP and we have agreed at outline plan approval that houses be built on this site. And it is our job to make sure that we do get the best for any area. And I don't think we have got the best here. When you look at page 19, there's buff coloured brick, which if it was totally buff coloured brick, it would also be boring. But because there's contrasts in colour, the reddish roof, a bit of white render, a buff coloured brick and dark window frames and door frames, that to me is acceptable. I won't say it's the best design, but it's acceptable. But if you go on to the page 21 and 22, which I've drawn the panel's attention to, it's dark, it's miserable. And I think what doesn't help is that there's dark window frames and dark doors in what looks like a darkish red brick with a dark roof. And I do expect better than that because we as the public are looking at it. We may not live there, but we're having to look at it. And I don't think that is acceptable. And if we may trust our officers, perhaps they could have further discussions with the developers to see if they could do something about it and not to go against. Have you quite finished, Mr. Carr? Right. Not to go against what the aspirations of this panel want. And I do feel very strongly about that second access. I accept what the highways officer says, that it was dangerous, but if you look on the plan, that entrance is as wide as other roads in the area. So I don't understand what the problem was there. And to say that, oh, we've built a circular road which is wider and that will do, I don't think that is good enough. So I will be voting for this, but I do expect the officers to try to do what the panel want.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must get a bigger pen to wave, that's the thing.
Sorry?
I say I must get a bigger pen to wave, yeah. Right. I think I would just like to start by saying that getting the papers for this and opening the illustration part at page 5, your heart sinks when you look at this. We see it so often, sort of a jam-packed full site, houses rubbing shoulders with each other. It obviously, when you look at the density on the site, however they play with their suggestions of design, nothing can relieve the fact that there really are far too many people living in one small space. It's a fact, we can't get away from it. It's legal, okay, but we don't have to like it. The question of access. I know it's been flogged to death almost, but do you remember we had a site on the outskirts of Wetherby a few years ago, with not quite as many houses as this. And that had to have 2 accesses because that's what policy said. Now, okay, you know, I miss an awful lot in the world, I'm afraid, but I probably missed this policy changing. But if not, you know, why didn't we apply the policy? That's not a question, it's a questionable statement. Not questionable in that sense. Design, yeah, we've had an awful lot to say about this. I was a bit disturbed by the fact that when I asked my question about the fact of houses being designed as opposed to tweaked, and that it was the agent for Persimmon who answered me and not the architect, who I would have thought might have either been outraged that I suggested that he hadn't designed these houses or whatever. So I don't know whether you need to draw your own conclusions from that. And I feel a bit churlish because they did put me some chimneys on some houses. And, you know, it's the first time that's happened in quite a while. So I do appreciate that. A little comment about electric charging points in all the houses, even the affordables. I mean, I can't afford an electric car, and I don't think I'd qualify for an affordable house. So I'll just leave that hanging in the air. Pardon? Well, yeah. Yeah. But you know, policy doesn't always have to be sensible. Right. One thing I would just, this is sort of general comment here. We have a site in my ward, which is very, very similar to this. This is going to take about 9 years to build out. It'll probably be 10 by the time they get round to it. I've got one which is in my ward, which is in its 16th year, and it hasn't yet been adopted. There are people who've been paying a management charge for many years who are getting sweet Fanny Adams for it, really, in terms of real return, because the management company doesn't want to take on responsibility for things that are affected by us not having adopted the roads, sewers, lights, etc., on that site. And it's not, in this case, it's not the council's fault, but I do mention that as a warning that, you know, we've got a lot of very unhappy residents who, in a sense, blame us for not sort of sitting on this more strongly. And another thing that happened there is that the 106 agreement probably go down in history as the worst 106 agreement ever written by Leeds City Council. It does need to be incredibly well written when you're looking at something that's going to go on as long as this, because the ramifications of things not being done accordingly. When you get 10 years down the line and somebody tries to remember what was said 10 years ago and it wasn't quite put in the right words in the 106, you end up with mammoth problems. So with those caveats, I appreciate it's a SAP site. We don't have a fat lot of choice really here, but it isn't one that I could support with a happy heart. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just a very quick comment. I just wanted the opportunity to state publicly that I do agree with Councillor Cohen's analysis, and subsequently I agree with Councillor Latty's too. I just don't think an inspector would, Councillor Cohen. And I think we need to move much more swiftly to a point where inspectors would be far more likely to agree with that view.
Something completely different, and I apologise for not raising this earlier. We talked about a lot about drainage on the site and an attenuation area being formed. Can I just request that every house does have a water butt which is environmentally friendly and helpful to the householder?
again, quickly, Chair, I've just been reading the minutes for the 2017 meeting. And I hope the four of us who were still here have the benefit of remembering it. And if you recall, at that meeting, in effect, I proposed that we didn't accept the outline application because it wasn't policy compliant. And the majority of the panel at that meeting, and I think if I'm honest, that was at the point where we were under considerable pressure about the 5-year land supply, if I'm honest. But the majority of the panel didn't agree with me, and we agreed that. So it seems to me that vast elements of this application we stuck with. So the single access is one of them. None of us like it. I attempted in 2017 to get it turned down on that basis. It wasn't agreed. To give the developers their due, this is much better than it was. But one of the other things that was raised in 2017, because we were shown an outline layout at the time, was in fact that layout. And I still have some concerns about this, and I think probably it will get through, but I worry about if you put the school in the middle of there, the traffic associated with the school will use the internal yellow route as a circular route round. And I still feel that this layout could be tweaked to make it a safer layout for people coming to the school in particular, because they're a different clientele to the people who live there. So at the moment, I can't support the layout, and I'm being consistent because I said that in 2017. But I am mindful, as Caroline says, that actually we haven't really got anywhere to go on this one, and it's actually much better. And I think for that reason, as I say, I find it really difficult to support this, but we are where we are.
Colin, and your recollection is the same as mine regarding land supply at the time. Yes. Robert, your last one?
Yeah, very, very briefly, just on the off chance I might lose this one. In terms of the conditions, can we add a condition that forms a local liaison committee? We've got a pile of persimmon sites across Morley. All have been appallingly run. All have created all sorts of problems. I've sent enforcement officers out to most of them. Indeed, an enforcement officer is visiting one of their sites this afternoon because of poor behaviour there at that particular point. So could add an extra condition that a liaison committee that's formed with local councillors, that they are obliged to come and listen to, because at this particular point their history of listening and being good neighbours is poor. And also, can we pledge to give the ward members a thorough briefing on the site management plan so we understand what their obligations are, because they've been weak and feeble in the past, and grounds maintenance plan, because their ground maintenance plan at Daisy Hill isn't worth the paperwork that it's written upon, and we want to make sure that we're fully briefed, because these extra areas are going to be important. It's important that they are maintained appropriately, and as Graham's already pointed out, if you don't get this right, people are paying a management cost. We want to make sure that in another 5 years' time, 10 years' time, I don't have a load of residents on my back complaining about the fact that these grounds aren't being maintained appropriately. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Robert. If I may, I'll bring Jonathan in on that point. I'm not sure if it's not on the outline. I don't think we can do that, but it can be explained technically by a planner.
Yeah, I think to set up a liaison group formally, that would have to have been dealt with within the outline Section 106 agreement or via condition at that point. This is purely an application to look at the details of, as we said, appearance, landscaping, etc. But clearly the developer's here, and there's no reason why they couldn't want to engage with that. I'm sure it'd be to their benefit to do so, to minimise the potential for complaints going forward.
And we're all looking at you at the back.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's fine. So I was just looking over to the applicant, because I'm not actually from Persimmon, so I was just getting the thumbs up. So yeah, that's fine. They'll
what we've just agreed, please.
Yes, thanks. I had another very lengthy debate and discussion with lots of questions about all aspects of the scheme.
Try again.
Yeah, I'll just say we had a very lengthy debate and discussion again with lots of questions about every aspect of the scheme, I think, particularly the concerns that were raised at the previous meeting. So that covered things like drainage, generation of school places and the need for the school, house design, sustainability and the phasing of the schemes, cycle, footpath segregation, parking prevention on the grass verges, and lots of other aspects as well, which I don't need to repeat here, but I think clearly members were minded to approve the application, but with an additional condition regarding prevention of parking on the grass verges, which the developer did indicate that they were willing to consider. We'll also, as officers, look at the materials to ensure that the concerns raised about the sort of relatively dark appearance of some of the dwellings is reconsidered. And we'll look to discuss with local members regarding the construction management plan and the implementation of other plans within that outline permission as well, to make sure that there is that ongoing liaison. And we've heard that the developer is agreeable, or appears to be agreeable, to the establishment of a liaison group locally to look at the rolling out of the scheme as well.
I think that's some.
Thank you.
I think that sums it up, John. Thank you very much. Can I thank you for your attendance? Very interesting discussion, and thank you for that. Very enjoyable. Sat here listening to it all. Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. I'm speaking for myself. Can I warn you that on the 25th of October, it's going to be a busy meeting. It's not likely to be just one. So, yeah, November. Did I say something else? September. Well, there you are. So I'll see you then. Anyway, safe journey home. Thank you.